Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about Three Houses, and originally I just wanted to talk about this character, but then in thinking critically about how this character impacts the world, we're also going to be using them as a framework to critique the game in a larger sense. You can tell from the title of this video that character is Ignatz Victor from Fire Emblem Three Houses. So for me, I love Fire Emblem Three Houses. If you watch any of my videos, you know that it is one of my favorite games of all time. It's the game that I have the most hours in. I really, really like it. With that being said, it is not without flaw. I think the game, it has some gameplay issues, it has some storytelling issues, and, you know, it's kind of lofty with its cast size. And surprise, surprise, not every character is going to be as good as the next. And I think Ignatz is an example of good dialogue writing, strong characterization, but has a lack of presence in the story. Granted, in Three Houses, one of its flaws is that the other house members don't really matter, and they're not intrinsic to the story itself. They're more just like the fun band of folks who are along for the ride. But I think Ignatz especially, there's not much of a reason for him to be there. Ignatz is a son from a big merchant family in the Leicester Alliance. He's becoming a knight to please his father, but it's not necessarily what he wants. He's very passionate about the arts, very passionate about history. He's really into religious history as well. And it's expressed in a lot of his supports that he really wants to pursue being an artist in some capacity. He also worships the divine feminine, which I think is very, very fun. Just a sensitive artist's soul. You can tell that being a knight really isn't what he wants, and he's forcing himself to do it for the sake of his family. I like this character a lot. That's the reason for this video. As it stands right now in the game that we got, he, as a character, is underwritten, and they just could have done more. From a strictly gameplay perspective, Ignatz is not a very strong unit. He doesn't have great defense. He doesn't have great offense. He has bad growths pretty much across the board, except for his dexterity. A lot of pro players who are much better than me at this game in the strategic sense, they bench him. They don't even use him. The only thing he's really good at is being accurate, and that comes from his personal skill. So on higher difficulties, it is easier for him to hit enemies. But that's kind of the only strength he's bringing to the table, because he can't like one-shot anybody. He doesn't get any crazy unique abilities. His strengths are swords, bows, authority, and he has magic as a budding talent. And yes, he has good authority, but his charm isn't very great, and he has access to magic, but his spell list isn't very good. Ignatz rests in this niche of not necessarily being the best at anything. So in a game where you have a sandbox class system where anybody can be anything and use any weapon, it's not as obvious for him to know where to go, and it's not necessarily as fun to put him in these different roles, because he's going to be kind of like a jack of all trades, master of none in the truest sense. Most people just leave him as a sniper just because he does have good accuracy and it grants access to Hunter's Volley, which is a really good skill. I also like using Ignatz as a dancer just because every playthrough I do, I never know who to give that to. But because he's not like the strongest, might as well have him in a supporting role. I think through the lens of this character, you could argue that the class system of Three Houses and the freedom it affords is flawed, specifically just because it doesn't serve him. Also, I have a bit of a bone to pick with the class system in Three Houses. I don't think it's very good. I understand what they were going for. However, if they were going to do an effectively 4-tier class system, I think they should have really bulked out those like middle layers of classes, because really all they did was take classes that already exist and then truncate them into a 4-tier system when there was already like a pretty diverse 2-tier system, and they removed a lot of classes from the 2-tier system anyways. So I just find that the class system is lacking. And while technically any class can use any weapon, you do need specific weapon proficiencies in order to get into those classes. So it kind of discourages you straying from what the characters are good at. But because Ignatz doesn't have a lot of overlapping strengths with existing classes, you could make him an assassin. That's probably your best bet specifically on what he's proficient in. but most people choose the sniper route. So with this character as like a piece on a chessboard, he's not great. Not a lot of use out of him. Story-wise, just in general, he doesn't want to be there. Very little is anchoring Ignatz to the school and to the narrative. He and Raphael definitely feel like outsiders compared to most of the other characters. Every class technically has commoners as a part of it, but Dorothea is a character of really high esteem because she's a celebrity, but she's not technically a noble. Ash, I think, is like listed as a commoner, but he's been adopted into a noble family. The Golden Deer is the only house to truly have like actual commoners as a part of it. And I think given the game's setting the way it is right now, that kind of doesn't work. Because literally, how can they be there? Most of the characters in Three Houses don't have a lot to do, but because so many of them are nobles, there is at least the implication of greater consequences in the world for how they choose to be and how they choose to lead their lives. So much of this game is about family and about lineage, but because we don't see families and Ignatz isn't from a politically important family, he just has very little to offer the narrative, as does Raphael. Their personal arcs are pretty contained to each other. Ignatz is, like I said earlier, he's expected to be at the school because of his father's lofty expectations and because for some reason his brother is getting exclusive rights to the business. And Ignatz feels some personal guilt because Raphael's parents, who are also merchants, took on a job that Ignatz's parents couldn't do, but then they died while doing that job. So while the circumstances are completely out of Ignatz's control, he still feels bad about it. That's his whole arc. There's not really much there. Like, there's some emotional weight, but that's easily worked through by Raphael and their supports, because he's like, that doesn't make any sense. You shouldn't feel bad about this thing that had nothing to do with you. He has some really great supports outside of this relationship. Lorenz offers to allow Ignatz to be a knight on behalf of House Gloucester. He and Marianne have like really great supports together. They're probably my favorite in the game, but they just like discover this zest for life together through the arts, and it's really beautiful. And in their ending together, I guess like very minor spoilers for a game that came out several years ago, but Ignatz paints what becomes a very famous painting of Marianne and her horse Dorte, and then I think like an opera is made down the line of those two and their romance. It's really good. The subtle implications of a small box of text at the end of this game for what these characters become is really, really great. In general, I think it would have been beneficial to see a bit more of his family life. It would have been beneficial to see more of his family life to better understand his motivations. Like, it's not really clear why his father wants him to be a knight and why Ignatz can't just be a merchant, either with or without his brother. I think that's a general problem that runs throughout Three Houses, is that we hear a lot about these families, but we don't see them. It's a really bad case of like show, don't tell. So this brings me to the bigger issue in Three Houses, which is that Garrick Mach as an entity is underwritten. There just isn't enough nuance explored with what they were trying to do by situating this military school in the middle of 3 continents. Why is that allowed to exist? Like a church-sanctioned school that brings really high-profile rulers together and teaches them only military skills and strategy. It is kind of touched on in Edelgard's Roots that this is a problem and that it's fucked up that the church does this. But because Three Houses is so far up its own ass and is like really interested in maintaining its mystery, so it doesn't give information at an appropriate pace, and because it doesn't want to give you all of the answers, it fails to explore some really important details. So this is touched on in Edelgard's Root that it's fucked up that this church school can do this, but they don't lean into it hard enough. IMHO. My next issue with the school is like, how rich do you have to be to go there? Because every other character, I understand why they're there, but for Leonie, Ignatz, and Raphael, I'm like, are they rich enough to go to this school. Reasons are given as to why they're there. Leonie has funds from her entire village, and that's why she's at the school. Raphael and Ignatz, they both come from merchant families. But are they like rich? Like, are they 1% rich, or are they normal working class folks? This is not explored, because if Ignatz was like extremely rich and going to Garrick Mock, like, I could kind of understand. But it seems like a lot of people can just get into this like really esteemed school. So once again, this character doesn't need to go to army school because he could just be a merchant. Maybe Ignatz's family isn't super duper wealthy, so maybe he's like not doing great in school and there's like a threat that he might fail. That's also something that doesn't go explored, is like academic flops, because not all of these people are cut out to be excellent soldiers. A lot of them are just there because they're rich, which makes sense because rich people get stuff all the time. So maybe Ignatz isn't doing too hot, and so there's a sense of pressure from his family that he really needs to be upping the ante because they're footing the bill for this school. Maybe, and this is my best idea, IMHO, Ignatz's father is angling to establish his own house and wants to become nobility. So if he himself is a very wealthy merchant and his son becomes an esteemed knight, perhaps he commits some very heroic deeds, gets recognized by the oligarchy that they're a part of. They can have an established house and rise to status and become these nouveau riche folks, an emerging class of new nobility, the bourgeoisie. Okay, all this stuff might seem unrelated to each other and might seem disjointed, but it all makes sense in the end. Please just trust me, just go with me. So I've talked about how the existence of the school is questionable, and I've talked about how this character going to the school is questionable. So that leads me to a discussion about classes, both academic and character job classes. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think there are pros and cons to having a sandbox system where anybody can be anything and wield any weapon. In previous Fire Emblem games, weapon proficiency is locked to a class. Classes are pre-established at the very beginning of acquiring a character, and then they can upgrade into an advanced class in most games only once, and going into that advanced class usually allows them to use one more weapon type on top of the one that they already know. None of that exists in Three Houses. I think a way to maintain this sort of sandbox style, but still like shoe in a way to add more classes and make that make sense, would be if there was a magic split, because there's reason and faith magic, and every magic wielding class in Three Houses is just able to use any magic for being in that class. But if there was a limitation to that, because there's already a limitation to using magic in general, more than there is with any other weapon, because every class can use any weapon, but not every class can use magic. So if they added another restriction to that, being every class that can use magic can't necessarily use both types of magic, you could add in a bunch more classes. And then you add in another layer of choice, because you could go for maybe a class that is better at magic and can use both types of magic, but maybe isn't as like physically viable. Or you could have a class that maybe can only use healing magic, maybe can only use that offensive magic, on top of having certain weapon skill proficiencies, etc., etc. This way too, I think they could have retained a lot of the classes that were introduced in Fates, especially just because that game I feel like has the most selection of class options. Like, I enjoyed that the adventurer class can use bows and staves. I like that they introduced the malignite class that can use axes and tomes. These are just interesting combinations that the series hadn't explored thus far, but then got sacrificed in Three Houses. I think a magic divide and more classes could add a layer of nuance into player decision. Next, narratively, I think the central school, instead of exclusively being a military school, I think it should be like a My Hero Academia style institution where there's multiple different courses and programs that you could take. I didn't completely redesign what the entire school should be, or like, you know, as a university, basically, like how much it should offer. But I think at the very least, it would make sense if there was like some sort of leadership element of the academy, and then like a merchant academy. And then, you know, there's your faculty of arts, your faculty of science, things like that. But again, in the lens of Ignatz and talking about this character, there should be a school of commerce. Ignatz should be going to business school, and he should become the merchant class, which would basically be the adventure class. You know, there's a focus on bows, but he can use like healing magic, and maybe instead of a boon in reason, he has a boon in faith. Or it uses reason magic exclusively and not faith magic. But I think Ignatz should have a strength in faith magic because he's very interested in the goddess, as we discussed earlier. I think the expansion of what Garrick Mach could be would serve the narrative in multiple ways. Having multiple programs at the school would really lend itself to ensuring that each of the characters has a reason endowed with a lot more personal stakes to be going to this school than what we were given in the actual game. It could expand the cast's interests and characterizations just because the school has more to offer, and in their support vignettes, it would give them more to do. Also, as like a political power, it could probably yield more support for the church in this world because it's producing more than just like leadership and military prowess. Like, it's a legitimate academic institution that fosters learning and could lead to actual jobs. Like, it should just be a university and not a military school. That's it. That's all I'm saying. Like, it should just be an actual school and not like Hogwarts, but for war. Also, Anna, the character, is a series staple, and they really shoehorned her into this one as like a DLC character. But maybe Anna is just like the head of the faculty of business, and she's just teaching classes, and she has a real reason to be here. These are just my thoughts. This really was a PowerPoint presentation of like how this character could be better, and also how the game could be better, because I thought about this character too hard, and I had a lot of ideas that I wanted to share. If this video was nonsensical, I am so sorry. I am so tired, and it is -40 where I live. That is all I have. I hope you found this interesting. If you want to see more deep dives into characters of video games in this format, if you want to see more Three Houses characters talked about like this, when Fire Emblem Engage comes out and you want some in-depth character analyses like this, leave it in the comments. Feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me what you want. Subscribers get priority boarding though, so if you want to hear something from me, subscribe. Goodbye. Hopefully this video is uploaded in the morning.